Hello and welcome everyone. I see we've got participants joining quickly, rapidly. Numbers going up, so I'm going to give maybe about 20 seconds more so that people can get into the session and get settled. Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming and joining us. This is the panel discussion, Reimagining Policing, what the polling data tell us. So if that's what you came for, you're in the right place. Okay. Looks like we've got quite a few people here. So without further ado, we'll get things started. My name is Josh Clark. I am the political participation analyst at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, and also senior researcher at Tides Advocacy. Again, this is the panel Reimagining Policing, what the polling data tell us. I'm going to be facilitating the conversation today because I had the privilege of collaborating with all of the speakers on this panel over the summer in designing a survey on policing that was administered in Minnesota, as well as a companion national survey. So these surveys were conducted in September, less than 4 months after the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We're going to hear more about the survey design, results, and implications from each of the panelists from their respective positions and perspectives. But I'll just start kind of by way of introduction, saying that the goal of the survey was really to center Black voices and experiences and to have data to put those voices at the center of conversations in Minnesota about policing and the needs for transforming policing and how to reimagine public safety at a moment in time where it felt like Black communities were actually being squeezed out of the public dialogues on these important decisions and proposals. So I'll leave it to the panelists to tell you more about how that went. First, we'll hear from Amber Jones, who is Outreach Coordinator at the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage, CIMA, which really spearheaded the survey project and worked in close collaboration with the Othering and Belonging Institute to make it happen. After Amber, the next speaker will be Angela Myers, who's president of the Minneapolis NAACP and also a research assistant at the Roy Wilkins Center at University of Minnesota. And finally, we'll hear from Ernest Comer, Associate Director of the African American Leadership Forum. A couple of housekeeping matters before I hand it over to Amber. As a reminder, there is CLE credit offered for this session. And I wanted to invite all of you, as we're listening to the speakers, to go ahead and put questions in the Q&A throughout the session. You don't have to wait until the end. After each speaker, I'll probably ask like 1 or 2 questions, and then after everyone has spoke, we'll also have an opportunity to do a discussion. So any additional questions we'll be able to toss to all of them. So as they pop up in your head, go ahead and put the questions there. Don't be shy. And with that, I'll hand it over to Amber.
Thank you, Josh. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session. I'm so excited to do this panel discussion with Josh, Angela, and Ernest, some really great individuals in our community, in our country, as we've been working on this poll and really trying to utilize the data from this poll to really move forward important conversations when it comes to policy solutions in the matter of policing. So like Josh said, I work for the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage as the outreach coordinator. And we are actually a state agency and an ethnic council for the state that was instituted by state statute in 1980 to really serve as an advisory space for the legislature and for the executive leadership for the governor's office. And so a lot of our work is really focusing on how do we make sure that African heritage Minnesotans are represented in all of our spaces of government at the state. And how are we making sure that when it comes to policy solutions that we are at the table? And so it was really natural for us to be a part of this project that actually, we started this project prior to Justin Terrell, who was actually our former executive director, and then came over to the Justice Research Center. And so we just want to say thank you to Justin for including us in this work and allowing us to also be in this space this morning. So we partner with the Othering and Belonging Institute led by John Powell and Prosperity Now, led by Gary Cunningham, to do a poll focusing on public safety, policing issues, and also economic justice issues. And what we saw over the summer is that in the midst of everything that happened in the uprising following the death of George Floyd, that there was a lot of different conversations about what should we do, what policies should we push for, what organizing should be done. And we wanted to be in a position to be able to bring data to the forefront that really reflected what Black communities in Minnesota really felt about these issues. And so we wanted to equip advocates and community leaders with tangible data to better inform and support their work. We also wanted to make sure we collected a large sample from Black Minnesotans, as most polls on these issues throughout the country had majority white respondents. So we did an intentional oversampling of about 400 Black respondents in Minnesota. And then there was additional oversampling at the national level. And we also want to use these findings to really help inform the policy strategies and the advocacy, not just the organizing, but also pushing into policy at various levels of government. And so we can see that this data can be helpful at the local level, the state level, and also the federal level, as we did a national poll as well, so that public agencies, policymakers, and government leaders now can have more data to help guide these critical policy solutions. And so how did we come together to do this work? How did we design this poll? So I'm going to talk briefly about the design process. And so as I mentioned, OBI, SEMA, and Prosperity Now, we were the core partners working with the Lake Research Group, and can't say enough how grateful we are for the partners at Lake for doing such great work to create, disseminate the poll, and to really break it down for us. And for SEMA, we led an outreach process that includes stakeholders like Ernest and Angela and others from the African heritage community across the state of Minnesota to really make sure that the way that we structured the poll will really get the grit and the meat that we really needed in the data so that we can reflect that back out to the community. We also included staffers of African heritage in the state enterprise and legislature systems that work directly on public safety issues. So just shout out to Beef to Adam and Jamel Lundy in particular. They also gave a lot of great feedback as well. So we did some great work to bring in community and state voices, but people who are centering Black lives in their own life and then in their work. And so we held a series of sessions to follow up and really drill down on the number of questions, the language of the questions, really like hitting those words. And they really, our advocates and partners really gave some really comprehensive feedback. So we just want to continue to thank you. So I'm going to transition into talking about some high level results from the data. And so we have tons of results from the data, and I will put in the comments some resources where you can grab our executive summary and also my contact information if you want to have access to more even detailed data, because we have that as well. But I want to just talk about what are the top policy ideas that came out of this data and just some of the top findings. So I'm going to start talking about what are some popular policing ideas that were popular across the board amongst Black, white, Latinx Minnesotans. The first was around residency requirements. So requiring police officers to live in the cities or towns in which they police, very popular across the board. The next was creating independent civilian oversight boards with the power to discipline police officers. So those additional spaces that are ran by civilians and giving another layer of power in the process, very popular. Another policy idea was having community resource professionals like social workers, paramedics, and mental health workers respond either alongside or instead of police officers in encounters that may involve homelessness, drug addiction, mental illness, and other nonviolent offenses. Very popular. And we also did a split sample saying, do you want them alongside police officers or instead of, and still was popular across the board. Another important and popular policy was requiring that police officers maintain liability insurance to cover costs of civil suits concerning misconduct, as many states might require doctors or lawyers to do. And then finally, another popular policy was ending the relationship between police departments and ICE. So to transition, there were some policies that were particularly popular among Black Minnesotans, but received a little bit of pushback from white Minnesotans. These included reducing police funding, so decreasing the police budgets and reallocating that money to community-led solutions. There was more of a plurality among white Minnesotans, but it was very popular among Black Minnesotans. And then also decriminalizing low-level criminal offenses. And so that was also very popular, particularly among Black Minnesotans. And then finally, I want to talk about one of the major conversations we've had in our public discourse, which is disbanding police departments. So this had some very interesting data along with it. There was strong opposition among white Minnesotans. And then there was more of an even division among Black Minnesotans. And so it was around 50% supported it. And then when we saw a breakdown among age in particular, we saw much stronger support among younger Black Minnesotans. And then as the respondents grew older in the data, we saw a stronger opposition. And so just wanted to share some of that top line data. We also had a section of the poll that focused on economic justice, and we have that information as well in our executive summary, which I will share. I know some people are asking in the comments. I will share a link for that for you. But I know we're focusing on policing today, but we wanted to include that economic justice piece, particularly as Prosperity Now focuses on economic justice issues, and also because we are dealing with a double pandemic alongside issues of racial justice and policing, but also how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting the economy. And so we have a lot of great information on that as well. But one of the intersections I can share with you is that across the board, both Black and white Minnesotans supported fair hiring practices to remove barriers to employment for those with a criminal history. And so we can see some intersection there, that there's strong support in making sure those who have had past criminal offenses have fair access to employment. So to close my section, what does the data illuminate as far as navigating these tensions? And so we kind of knew coming into this process that this data might bring us some things that might be uncomfortable to sit with, or might illuminate some tensions that we were maybe advocates on the ground had already seen in their organizing or in their advocacy. And so we really wanted to be able to use this data as a conversation starter, as an invitation really to be able to wrestle with those issues in community. And I know that Ernest and Angela will speak more to it, but we are really excited to be able to see that the things that we see in the data is affirming what we're seeing on the ground, so that we can really have those conversations among some of those most discussed and debated policy issues that don't show clear support or opposition across the board. That's really where we can dive into some of these nuances and really get to the root of the issues, and really be able to hopefully come out of that process with some very clear, tangible, comprehensive policy solutions, and really be able to really focus on the need, or really enhance or reinforce the need for deeper political education on these issues as well. Because a lot of things have, I would say in the state of Minnesota, a lot of things have moved very fast over these past few months when it comes to issues around policing and public safety. And maybe some of this data is telling us we may need to do some deeper work. We do need to make sure we're having some immediate short-term solutions, but we don't want to lose sight of the real work of actually engaging with our community members, actually building with our neighbors and our neighborhoods, and be able to come out with something strong in our local government spaces, in our policy spaces. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to turn it back over to Josh. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amber. That was really great. So as I said, I wanted to pause to give a question or two at the end of each talk. Since we don't have any questions yet in the chat box, I get to take advantage, which is good with me. You mentioned there at the end that, with some of these policies where maybe we see not quite as high of levels of support just yet, you talked about political education and doing that work in the community and changing conversations through organizing and so forth. I wondered actually in connection with that, if you could say a little bit about the results on police carrying liability insurance like doctors and lawyers do. Something that stood out to me in the results was that in Minnesota, you had 80% of Black respondents saying that they supported that policy. And that compared to only 64, I mean, still high, but 64% of Black Americans nationally. And you didn't see that kind of discrepancy on that policy among whites, where there was more or less support in whites in Minnesota or whites nationally. But you saw this really, really high support for that policy proposal in Minnesota. And my understanding is that it has to do with like organizing efforts or activities in Minnesota. I wanted to hear more about that.
Yeah. This issue in particular has had very consistent organizing for over a decade, I would say, or probably longer. I know that organizations like Communities Unite Against Police Brutality, that's one of the core things that they push for. And they have been doing a lot of work to track any police related murder or incident for a very long time. And actually, we were able to share some of that data with the Department of Human Rights in their investigation on the Minneapolis Police Department. And so there's a lot of consistent organizing in some of these issues, these policy areas already. And I also think in particular, we've been having more conversations around issues of policing, and particularly around the budgets. I think that connects very nicely because people seem to understand, and particularly Black Minnesotans seem to understand that a lot of the times the burden to cover police officers for their misconduct falls back on taxpayers in particular, falls back on the cities to actually pay out those settlements. What's the benefit for police officers to really change their behavior, or the motivation to change their behavior if they're not held financially liable? And so that is something that is a consistent policy solution that's brought up in different spaces to say, hey, put the financial burden back on the officers and maybe they will change their behaviors.
That's great. Thank you for explaining that. Yeah, I feel like that's a really powerful kind of proof point for people who are looking for, what's happening with community leaders and organizing, changing narrative, changing attitudes. This is a powerful one. You can see it right there in the data, what the organizing and work around that issue has led to. So thanks for that. I'm going to turn it over to you, Angela. And you can go ahead and start when you're ready.
Thank you, Josh. And thank you to the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage, CEMA, better known as, for including me as a stakeholder in this conversation. So I am Angela Rose Myers, president of the Minneapolis NAACP. The NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And we were started in 1909 out of the Niagara movement, started by trailblazers like Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois, along with a number of white allies. So the NAACP has always been a Black-focused multicultural organization. So we have a number of white allies among our ranks, particularly in Minnesota. The Minneapolis NAACP was started by a number of folk like Frederick McGee, who was also part of the Niagara movement. He was the first Black priest here in Minnesota, and he started our historic St. Peter Claver, which is the first Black Catholic church here in Minnesota and in the upper Midwest. So the Minneapolis NAACP has been in this community since 1914, and we've had trailblazers like Lena O. Smith, who was our first Black woman president, who was also the first Black woman lawyer in Minnesota, as well as Josie R. Johnson, who was the first Black woman regent at the University of Minnesota, and she fought for fair housing in the 1950s and 60s. So we have always had a focus on policy issues. How the NAACP works nationally is doing a lot of advocacy work, on the one hand doing policy work and then also community programming. So how we see ourselves in our communities is as an avenue of access to power. So for regular community members who, feel passionate about different policy issues or different things that are happening in their community, we serve as an avenue for access to these organizations like SEMA, like elected officials, and so that regular everyday people can have their voices heard. With that, after the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent uprising, we saw a lot of community conversations happening. And they were happening both in the media, and they're happening on the ground as well. So what we also saw in that was almost a plurality of conversations that in a lot of ways was utilizing Black pain instead of Black voices. So in a lot of the conversations we saw in the media, they would talk about the Black Minneapolis residents and citizens, but yet oftentimes would not feature Black Minneapolis citizens on what they wanted and what their ideas were for our future. So in Minneapolis, we have been fighting for change in policy and policing for decades. The Minneapolis NAACP has been a part of it, and then also regular day community members. And so the thing is that anecdotally, you can say this is what community wants, but data creates an impact, particularly to elected officials, that even regular day community members, they don't have the power to emphasize. So one of the great things about doing a survey like this and the oversampling of Black Minnesotans is that we are actually talking to Black Minnesotans about what they feel and what their ideas are, and what do they strongly support, what do they not so strongly support, and what are their priorities. And so with that, I think that coming from the community side, it's powerful that a coalition like this particularly did a survey, because we have had surveys before. So in Minnesota, we're often, North Minneapolis has often said that they are the land of surveys. There's always a survey happening, but unfortunately, the surveys to actualization, that's where the disconnect often is. So it's one thing to do a survey, and then if you have a small sampling of folks, the authenticity or the authority of that survey is undercut. So that's a good thing that we had in oversampling, is that we actually talk to people. We can actually say we have 400 Black Minnesotans, and this is, along survey lines, that's a pretty good sampling of Black Minnesotans. And so, we have that, and we can build that through SEMA and through, organizations like ALF and the NAACP, because we are the avenues to justice, in a lot of ways. We are the avenues to the actual policies that we saw outlined in the survey. A lot of these policies, actually, we can get them written up and hand them to elected officials, and with the support as stated in the surveys. So one of the things that I really liked about the methodology of the surveys, and then also the wording, is that the wording was along the lines of, do you strongly support? And the line of what it was initially a policy. It was a policy recommendation. And so that was something that I really appreciated, because then that can be easily translated. So one of the things that I saw in this survey, particularly around the civilian review board, this is something that we can do at the local level and the state level. So civilian review boards got a lot of traction and also got, a lot of support. But it was interesting that at the moment we did this survey, where the civilian review boards got a lot of support, there was actually not a quorum on the civilian review board in Minneapolis. So Minneapolis does have a civilian review board. It's called the Policing Conduct and Oversight Commission. And that is, something where it's just a commission every year in the fall. You can apply to be a part of it. The application for the review board, were low. A lot of white Minneapolis residents. And then also the review board itself comprised of 4 people, and then 3, when the requirement was 7. So they were not at a quorum even to do business at the time that this survey was administered. So how is it that we have a policy that a lot of people support, and we have that policy instilled in Minneapolis, not to the full extent? Our review board can give recommendations, but not to the same extent of disciplinary action. But we have this review board, and yet our community members either A, do not know about it, B, know about it and maybe don't know how to get on it, or C, they are not really invested in the same way. So doing that community education is going to be key for organizers like us, because we're not just asking for your support on these policy issues, but down the line, a number of these issues have to be acted on by civilians and have to be acted on by our communities. So it is not enough just to ask, do you support it? It has to be, that support has to be translated. And that translation is what, I come into. So our communities in a lot of ways do need that education piece, like Amber was saying. They support these policies, but then how do we translate it into making sure that these policies are actually codified in our laws and then enforced in the way that we want them to be? An example being body cameras. So in Minnesota, we fought for body cameras on officers, particularly in Minneapolis. And yet, once we fought for body cams, we had to go back and make sure that the body cameras were on. We had to go back and we had to fight to make sure that your police officers couldn't turn off their body cameras willy-nilly. So that's, one of the things that is a frustration, for community activists. But that's also a thing of educating our community, of saying the fight is never fully won. This is about progress, not perfection in a lot of senses. So the great thing about our laws and the great thing about our country is that our laws are able to reflect our values, because we have the power to go to elected officials, and we have the power to vote, and we have the power to be on these civilian review boards to raise our voices. Every single person in this country, every single citizen in this country, even those who are non-citizens, they have a power of civic engagement, whether they recognize it or not. And so, doing that work of educating is going to be a key highlight going forward. And so understanding what the public conversation is and making sure that all of our community is reflected in this public conversation is going to also be key. Something that I noticed in this survey that I really appreciate in the breakdown that I saw at least, was the coding of different income brackets. Also, different at times if ages, so generational differences, and then also the Black descendant of slaves community versus the Black immigrant community. And the interesting thing about this survey, particularly because of its oversampling, is that we could get a better breakdown of these communities and where we're aligning. So in Minnesota, there is a fallacy that the Black immigrant community and the Black community descendant of slaves are on, are very polarized. When in actuality, when looking at this data, we're not actually polarized, and there's more opportunities for collaboration than we're utilizing right now. And particularly among issues of policing, it seems that the Black immigrant community is right alongside us when it comes to the survey than we initially hypothesized. And so that's something that is a really rich conclusion that comes out of this survey. And that's something that says to me, perhaps where we have been siloed, we can find a lot of avenues of collaboration and a lot of bridges. So that is, the conclusion of my perspectives on the survey. Thank you, everyone, again. Thank you, Josh, the Institute for Othering and Belonging. Thank you, SEMA, for having us. This is a lot of wealth in what can activists and community organizers use going forward to energize, and where we can particularly use this data to create bridges and then also to do that community education. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was great. Yeah, I'm glad that that you brought up the last point about the oversample being able to capture the diversity of Black Minnesotan communities there at the end. And I want to acknowledge that, in fact, you were instrumental in making sure that that happened, because in the feedback loops and the conversations and collaboration that we had, you really pushed us to think about making sure that we could capture a reasonably decent size subsample of Black Minnesotans of immigrant backgrounds, folks that live outside the Twin Cities, and across income groups and generation. And really, you know, we started out, we were going to have a oversample where we talked to about 350 Black Minnesotans. And after, you know, reflecting on the input that you gave in the feedback, we got that, Prosperity Now, Othering and Belonging, SEMA went back and raised some more money and got it up to a little over 500. So that really made it possible to have those breakdowns like you talked about, to compare across different communities. So really appreciate, you know, your, you know, consciousness and awareness and pushing us on that, making that clear. So, okay, great. So I will now pass it over to Ernest. Go ahead and start when ready.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Thank you. First of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to just be here, be part of the conversation, and just want to echo the point that I really appreciate the level of thought, effort, and energy that went into the survey that was developed. It was much needed, and I see a significant impact coming from the work that's been done. So I'm glad to have been a part of it. So I want to talk a little bit about the experiences that I had in our community, starting with this idea of Mondays. I don't like Mondays too much. I think a lot of folks in our communities like Mondays. You know, you gotta get up early, get your week started, and it's when a lot of the grunt work takes place. But imagine it's Monday evening, and you know it's coming to the close of the day. You run to the corner store to grab a couple things, give the clerk a 20. They question whether or not it's real, and then all of a sudden, you find yourself in a situation where you're arguing about the fact that you just want to pay for the things that you came to buy, and then the police show up, and you spend the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of your life with an officer's knee on your neck while his colleagues hold your legs and hold the crowd back to make sure nobody interferes. Now imagine after that situation, your community steps up, makes a stand, and calls for an end to these unnecessarily fatal interactions with law enforcement. And that protest is met with rubber bullets and tear gas. This is the situation we find ourselves in. It's one of those things that, you know, to a degree, I recommend you try not to make sense of it all, because it doesn't make sense. And there's so many layers to the circumstance that need to be considered and that really need to be understood so that we can better know how to move forward in a way that brings wellness and healing to our community as a whole. So the African American Leadership Forum has been doing this work of what we call Black-centered design. And in recognizing that we're in a moment of crisis, we wanted to essentially test out this theory that we could leverage this process of taking into consideration the voice of our community rapidly in real time to understand what's happening and how we should best move forward. And so in order to test this theory, what we did was invited folks to participate in a quick listening session and get some ideas on, you know, what it is that's happening. in the space of community, what folks are feeling, and where we should go. We asked essentially 4 questions. What does it mean to defund the police? Like, what do you think of when somebody says that? What comes to mind for you? Then we asked this question of, like, what other systems are at play when you think about this thing? What tools or strategies need to be implemented? And then we asked who the experts are in our community. So this was our way of kicking off conversation about where we are and what's happening, so that we could move forward into work like building out a survey that has an oversampling and really have insight that we could lean into in a way that not only, acknowledges the dissent that exists in our community, but also calls out the things that we agree on, so that we can see in which ways our community would like to move forward collectively. Right. So we saw a ton of value in that. The challenge that we have right now is that we're in a place of needing to reimagine what can and should be true about where we are as a community. What does it mean for us to think through, if the police department should exist or not? What does that even mean? What do we want police to do? How do we want police to serve us? If we want that type of service to exist. We find ourselves struggling with this idea of understanding the systems that are at play beyond just policing, right? How do we take in consideration the economic impact that Amber mentioned? How do we take into consideration healthcare, intergovernmental departments, the prison industrial complex? How do we take all of these things into consideration, and recognizing all those pieces, come up with a solution that satisfies needs of our community in a way that brings us to the place that we would like to see ourselves, right? What does it mean to be aspirational in this context? Because there's so many different pieces at play that make it complicated for us to really get a vision for what the future can and should look like. One of the key things that we recognize is the importance of centering Black voice in that conversation. Like Angela mentioned, there's so many surveys that come out, and there's so many opportunities to engage in what happens in the context of policing. And too often we find ourselves boxed out from that experience, from that conversation, separated from that table where decisions are being made. And so this idea of centering Black voice is really what's at the heart and what's the cornerstone of what the African American Leadership Forum is focused on bringing to the table. So really just something that brought smiles to the hearts of folks on our team and in our network to see so much energy go into really understanding what is it that the Black community is experiencing, what is it the Black community needs to be addressed, and what is it that the Black community is feeling in the moments that we're experiencing right now. When we asked in our listening session and really brief survey with a much smaller sample size, because when we think about the Black Centered design process that we implemented for this separate research, it was really just in 72 hours, what can we learn, right? And so when we did that, it was, hey, let's throw the questions out there and see what responses we get in real time. And what we found was that our community identified a number of different things that needed to be addressed, but they were categorized mostly as police practices and policies and accountability for police. Right? Those are the two areas where our community wants to see things being developed. How can we demilitarize police? How can we set up a situation where, if I'm being stopped for a traffic violation, I don't have to worry about a gun being pulled on me by that officer? How do we create a situation where we're not forced to fear the folks who are serving us? Because that's what the relationship is intended to be when it comes to protecting and being of service to the community. So the the responses that we got really spoke to this idea that things need to change. And our community felt very split in the determination of what that means going forward, right? So some folks would say that defunding the police is the way to go, and this is what it should look like. Some folks would say dismantling the police department is, not the wisest thing to do. And here are some of the concerns that we have, some of the fears that came up, real concerns that were being presented by community in different contexts. We mentioned in the survey, we found that, younger folks in our community identified with that solution as something that's very, very valuable. And folks who are more senior in community felt as though it wasn't really the best way to go. And it isn't, my position to say one segment of the community is right and the other segment of the community is wrong. Position that we have as an organization, and for myself personally, is to identify what do we mean when we say the things we say, and how do we come to a place of common understanding, right? And so when we're reaching out to folks, who are our subject matter experts, who can bring context to the circumstances, who can help us understand the details, the intricate details of what happens in the work, we get that knowledge, we get that wisdom, and we contrast that with the experience of folks in community who say, this is what it feels like. And we leverage the insight that we get from those two perspectives, and we bring that together for the determination of a path forward that works for the collective. All right. The key is that we all end up in a place that's healthier, happier, and more capable of thriving. That's the whole point of why we do what we do. And, being part of the work of developing this survey, being part of the work of driving these conversations forward is what the forum is all about. We exist to convene, collaborate, and champion leaders throughout our community. And this work of bringing folks together to understand where we are and where we need to be is really just sits at the crux of why we exist. So I'm excited to be a part of this thing. I'm excited to see how things move forward, and really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation.
Thanks, Ernest. That was really great. Yeah, I mean, I see the work that the African American Leadership Forum did is really complementary to the poll that we all worked on together, and really that it provides an opportunity to fill in some of those gaps that you can't disentangle in survey work when you're actually listening to people's stories, listening to people talk through kind of their ideas around these concepts. You mentioned the policy proposal of decreasing funding for police and then redirecting those funds to, we said, community-based programs and services in the survey. And, we did find in the survey that there was a split, even among Black Minnesotans, on their view on that issue. But what was interesting is that it didn't fall along any of the kind of conventional lines that maybe we could have anticipated or expected. It wasn't that there was a big split between Black Minnesotans with recent immigrant backgrounds and ones that didn't have immigrant backgrounds. It wasn't a split along income lines, along educational attainment lines. Even age, it wasn't as much of a split as we would have expected. We thought that would have been maybe the divide. I wonder if you can say anything more about how different folks in the Black community or across Black communities in Minnesota were thinking about like what that meant, what the stakes were, and what might be kind of pros and cons, especially if they're thinking about what the policy proposal even means in different ways.
Yeah, there's so much about this thing that really lands on interpretation and language. And that's why language was such an important piece of the survey that was put together. And, we have folks who, whether you have exposure to, the industry of policing or you're separated from the work of government offices, policy development, you have a perspective on what it means to be policed. And so that the challenging thing for us is understanding what's in your mind about what it means to be policed. there's no way for me to sort of suss that out. What I can do is get an understanding of what exposure you've had to, like I said, the industry of policing and policy development and different things of that nature. And we can couple that with the experiences that you've had to lead you to where you are. And that helps us better understand how you come to the decision that you come to, which speaks to the value of incorporating the voices of folks who have had experiences with incarceration, right? If we don't bring to the table our second chance citizens, folks who have experienced that system from the inside out, then we fail to really appreciate the experience that they can share. What I want to make sure I get to your question. The thing is, if you have seen policing from the inside out, and your perspective is such that it's a necessary evil to a degree, or it's a system that must exist for the well-being of community, then you will lean in the direction of, let's identify a way for this system to exist in a way that is more healthy, right? If you come from the perspective that acknowledging the history of policing and, you know, the idea that it was established to support, you know, the slave industry, et cetera, then you will lean on the idea that, you know, perhaps policing should have been abolished at the same time as slavery being abolished. And how different is slavery from imprisonment in real time, in today's time? And, you know, so much relies on what it means for you internally. And that's why it's so important for us to continue these conversations, continue the dialogue, so that we can all get on the same page about what it is we mean when we say what we say, and how do we all move together in a way that makes us all feel that our community is in the best place it can.
Thanks, Ernest. That was a great answer and very insightful. Appreciate that. All right. We have about 10 minutes left this session. Yeah, absolutely. We can hit today's question live, Amber. Yeah, why don't I just hand it over to you, Amber, and and you can get that.
Yes, there was a really great question that came from Tay Moeller talking about what do we mean by defund. And I think that goes back to the survey design process. We talked a lot about some of the questions around the language of defunding in particular, because I think depending on who is evoking that language, it could mean different things. There are people who are seeing defunding as a route to abolishing, a route to abolition. I'm sorry. And there are those who see defunding and read that more literally as actually reducing funding. And so we made sure to have separate questions to really be able to see what was the where did people really fall on those particular issues. And it looked like as we saw, and I think I addressed some of these questions in the Q&A section, that we saw a really strong support among Black Minnesotans to reduce funding. And then we saw about 50% when it came to actually disbanding. We used the term disbanding in the poll. And so I think that speaks to what I was speaking earlier around political education, popular education. How are we talking about these things, these issues in our public discourse, and how are we having conversations with our community members on these issues? Because I do see that there's a lot of using that particular language of defund in a lot of different ways, depending on who is evoking that language. And so sometimes it can be difficult to actually really understand where people fall if we're leading with some of the language that has been heavily used in the public discourse. So we really wanted to make sure the poll opened up an opportunity for us to really drill down and see what people actually felt around specific issues around actually decreasing police budgets, which can be incremental, can be utilized as an incremental solution on the way to abolition, if that is what you're pushing for, versus outright disbanding, outright, ending the police infrastructure altogether. And if anybody else wants to jump on that as well, they can.
Yeah, so I definitely want to jump on that, particularly about the wording. Okay, so in another section that we didn't talk about today was particularly about voting, right? So we had a whole polling around voting, and particularly because it was COVID-19 and we're talking about early voting and absentee voting, we were looking at messaging and how to get people involved to vote in this past recent election. And so that polling that we had around, one major thing that stood out was the tracking your ballot. So making sure that we said you can track your ballot when you absentee vote, you can track your ballot. That was something that the NAACP immediately utilized right after this poll came out. And we found that people just love the idea of tracking their ballot. They love, the actualization of tracking their ballot. So wording, is so crucial, particularly in this activist space, because just like we found out, the word of defunding, the word defund, it has many heavy implications to many different people now. And it is interesting that right now, whenever we need to just start all of our conversations around policing, just breaking down what do we mean about defund, dismantle, and police reform. That is literally how we've been starting our conversations when we're having these conversations about policing, because it is not uniform what people believe about defunding the police. And it's not uniform about even, the theories about who is pushing defunding the police, who is pushing police abolition. That's not uniform of which groups are which. And so, breaking that down and that messaging is going to be crucial, because at the end of the day, what we are asking for has to be codified in the law. And the law has to be clear, because vague laws around policing, in our community particularly, lead to, loopholes and misuse of force and et cetera, and et cetera. So, we do have to be clear in this moment of what we want. And I think that's the tension point that we're finding, because unfortunately, earlier in the summer, people were not clear. Our elected officials were not clear about what they meant. And even some were, and then some were clear, but in a different opposite direction. So that's what, we need to definitely do going forward, is being clear about what we mean, and not really as much holding on to a, as much as it is, this is a policy word, this is a academic and some language word, defund, you don't have to hold on tightly to the word, but we want to hold on tightly to the transformation we want to see.
So I also want to call out that lack of clarity is what put us in this position where there was an attempt to get something on the ballot in November that got blocked because the language was unclear from the city council. And so now we find ourselves in a position where we have to wait another year to make a determination on something that's critical right now because of a lack of clarity and understanding what it is we're trying to get to at the end of the day, and even being clear on what is a significant amount of resources to pull away from policing if we're going to redirect funds. There was like a $1 million shift in the budget when the overall budget is over $200 million. And so what does it really mean to have a significant impact in how policing is funded and how community is funded in contrast?
Absolutely. Thanks for all the comments in the chat box. I agree. This has been a wonderful panel. We have about 3 minutes left. I wanted to ask a question about policy change prospects for the coming year, coming legislative session, or possibly other avenues through the executive. I'm not sure if we have enough time to really cover that, but maybe I'm still going to throw it to, maybe we'll start with Angela. See if you can give us just a few comments on that.
Now, something that came out of this was really exciting for me that was not in the policing section at all, but in the economic section, was the support, the overwhelming support for the, so basically the question was, do you support the state of Minnesota to stop doing banks that have proven to have racially discriminatory lending practices? That right there is a major game changer, in my opinion. If the state or local governments really push forward to stop doing business, to have, that accountability of stop doing business with banks that are proven to have racially discriminatory mortgage lending practices, different, practices in their banking. And that to me could get, it could get testy, because that means, in actuality, that means Wells Fargo, TCF Bank, that means some of these bigger banks that are here in Minnesota. But, the home ownership gap that is here in Minnesota is so wide, the racial disparities, and the banking, just like Earl Miller said in the chat, banking is very inequitable for people of color here in Minnesota. And so having that incentive to actually do what you're supposed to do and do it equally and fairly on the bank side, I think that would see a lot of wealth coming back into our communities. So, that out of the questions that the poll asked, the survey asked, I believe that one was the most well supported along white Minnesotans and Black Minnesotans. So across, white and Black Minnesotans, there was a lot of support for that type of policy. And that's something that I am excited about, because that's something we could hand to the government right now. But,
That's right. So Tim Walls, if you're out there listening, I saw you speak yesterday. Hope you heard what Angela just said. I am being told that we have to close. I wish we could keep talking. Maybe I'll keep talking with Ernest, Amber, and Angela on my own time, because I really would value continuing this conversation. But thanks to everyone for attending. Thank you so much to our speakers, Ernest, Angela, and Amber. This has been wonderful. Really, really value and appreciate your partnership in the survey project that we had together, and look forward to working together more in the future. And thanks to the Minnesota Justice Research Center for making this conversation possible.
Thank you. And thank you, Josh. Y'all don't know, this man worked so hard behind the scenes. So thank you so much, Josh, for everything you did for the poll and for this presentation.
Thanks.
Absolutely, not a pleasure. It's been great. Okay, thanks all.